Okay, quick note before we begin the podcast. I'm on the road. You can see with all the different changes of venue. And this interview that you're going to be watching with Amir Tibon was done a week ago. I was in a hotel room in New York City. There was nowhere appropriate to really sit and do an interview. I did my best. Thanks for putting up with it. I'll be back in my home studio next week. And now let's get to the podcast.
And I think the judges, and this was a panel that had two of the more liberal judges, but also Justice Noam Tibon, who's like this kind of conservative, a marker of the Supreme Court. They reached a unanimous decision, 3-0, that basically said, yes, the government has the authority to fire Ronen Bar, period. No discussion about that. The government can fire him, but there is a legal way to fire him and there is an illegal way to fire him. And
Right.
if you want to fire the head of the Shin Bet, which is one of the most sensitive positions in the Israeli government system, and remember, the Shin Bet has tools that, if used in an improper way, turn Israel from a democratic state to a police state, period.
That was the voice of Amir Tibon offering his views on the Israeli Supreme Court handling of the ongoing battle between the government and opposing interests regarding the quick and recent firing of Shin Bet head Ronen Bar. A prominent journalist, author, and currently the diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz newspaper, Amir presents a very different perspective than what you heard yesterday from member of Knesset Simcha Rothman. Amir is also a survivor of October 7th, having spent long, terrifying hours with his wife and two young daughters in their safe room in their home on kibbutz Nahal Oz, adjacent to the border with the Gaza Strip. Amir's father, retired IDF General Noam Tibon, eventually managed to rescue his loved ones that day, and the story of their miraculous rescue, as well as the decades of turmoil that led to that horrific event. It's all told in Amir's just fabulous book, Gates of Gaza. Check it out. Well worth the read. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Stay with us. Amir Tibon, great to see you. How are you?
Hi, good to see you, my friend.
I'm in New York City, where it is, I'm looking at the clock. It's just after 10 p.m., 10:10. And you're up at this ungodly hour, 10 after 5 in the morning in Israel. And thank you for being awake.
A good time to start the day, and obviously a lot to discuss. But, I went to bed earlier and the Trump tariffs were still in place. And I woke up very, very, very early today, not just for this interview, but for another Zoom that I had. And I saw that they have been rescinded or changed. So who knows what the hell is happening.
But we're not here to talk about tariffs. We're going to leave that to others. We're here to talk about all of the very kind of crazy domestic shenanigans that have taken place in Israel in the last few weeks. First, what I want to talk about is the Qatar Gate, as we've dubbed it, the Qatar Gate scandal, and what exactly it is. I just want you to explain it in your words. As I mentioned to you, I spoke with Simcha Rothman, whose interview we've already heard. I spoke with him about these issues on Sunday, and when I asked him to explain Qatar Gate, he said to me, well, I have no idea. Why don't you explain it? So
how convenient. I'm sure this is what he would have said if two top aides of former Prime Minister Yair Lapid were found to, allegedly, according to the police, receive high sums of money from a foreign government while working for the Prime Minister. I'm sure this is exactly what member of Knesset Rothman would have said.
So they're alleged to have received money, correct?
Yes, that's what listen, this is still an investigation, a suspicion. Everybody in this country is innocent until proven otherwise. But for now, what the Israeli police and the Shin Bet, and it's important to mention the involvement of the Shin Bet, our internal security agency, in this investigation. What they're looking into are allegations that 3, actually not just 2, but 3 of the top aides of Prime Minister Netanyahu, basically his media team, and these are guys that are very close to him, received payments from Qatar while working for Netanyahu. So basically Qatar, which is not an enemy state of Israel, it's important to note, okay? Qatar officially is not viewed as an enemy of Israel. There are business ties between the two countries. There are security ties. But Qatar, as Netanyahu himself said earlier this week, is a complicated country because of their years-long support for Hamas and for Al Jazeera, which we all in Israel view as a hostile entity. The idea that the same country that bankrolls Al Jazeera and bankrolls Hamas would pay people working in the prime minister's office in Israel, I think would have been unthinkable to any Israeli. If I had raised this as an option, let's say a year ago, Viv, you and I were talking.
Yeah.
In the midst of the war with Hamas, soldiers dying every day, hostages suffering the tunnels, I will tell you, Viv, right now we have people in the prime minister's office, who are on Qatari money.
Right.
And not a one-time thing. Receive payment after payment through Qatari lobbyists and interest groups, all while working for the Prime Minister of Israel. This is something we've never heard before in this country. And obviously, again, maybe at the end of the investigation, the police, prosecution, the Shin Bet will reach the conclusion that there was nothing illegal here and there was no security risk. But the fact that this is even being investigated is an earthquake. And for anyone like a member of Knesset Rothman to try to, look the other way, nothing going on here, is ridiculous. If this was going on in the Bennett or in the Lapid Prime Minister's office, they would be burning the streets. They would be accusing these people of treason.
So I just want to make very clear the point that even though these three individuals, as you say, were working in the Prime Minister's office, they actually technically were not on the Prime Minister's office staff roll or payroll, correct?
This is a big part of the story, Viv. Basically, these guys, we're talking about Jonathan Ulrich, Eli Feldstein, and Srulik Einhorn, three of the closest advisors to Netanyahu who have been working with him for, at least Ulrich and Einhorn for years. And they brought along Feldstein, who worked in the last election, by the way, with Itamar Ben-Gvir. These guys have been going with him for years, and all while being so influential in his orbit and his top messaging people. They are not officially employed by the Prime Minister's office, but they are there with him all the time. And this is part of the problem, that instead of receiving a government salary, like you would expect someone working directly for the Prime Minister, they are employed through all these weird contracts that are actually maintained by the Likud party. And I think one of the suspicions the police is looking into is that there was an expectation on behalf of Netanyahu that they would be making money from other sources, using their privileged position as people who are very close to the Prime Minister to take care of their own business. And they had this company doing PR that, according to the police investigation, and this was first reported by my colleague Bar Pelek in Haaretz newspaper, their company did PR work for Qatar around the time of the 2022 World Cup, and that this relationship continued, and that when they brought Eli Feldstein, who is the newest of the bunch, into Netanyahu's orbit during the war, immediately after October 7th, it was understood that he would not be paid directly by the Prime Minister's office for his work as Netanyahu's military and security spokesperson, but he would be paid through other sources. What sources? Qatari money. And so it all begins with this very technical irregularity, that instead of doing the right process,
Right.
bringing your advisors to be on the government payroll and for them to go through all the tests and the requirements that have to be checked before getting a government position,
Right.
you bypass the rules, you employ them in all these weird side deals, you expect them to earn other sources of income while working for you, and you end up with all of them in police investigation for receiving money from Qatar.
So I want you to just touch on 2 points that I think are also very important for our listeners to understand. Um, there were some very significant leaks, allegedly, again, made by this trio of individuals, and they were leaks with respect to hostage negotiations. And they were made to two media outlets. One is the Jewish Chronicle in the United Kingdom, and the other is Bild in Germany. Can you just talk very briefly about what those leaks were and why they were so significant? Because I think it relates significantly to the fact that these individuals did not have security clearance for the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, so this is a separate investigation from Qatargate, although I believe the two will be combined eventually because it's the same people. When we're talking about these strategic leaks to Bild and Jewish Chronicle that are being investigated also by the police, we're looking here at attempts to derail the hostage negotiations that were taking place specifically in the summer of 2024. And I
Right.
want to remind you of the public atmosphere at the time, Viv. This is around the time of the murder of the 6 hostages in Rafah. Okay, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, Eden Yerushalmi, Alex Lubanov, Ori Danino, Carmel Gat, and Almog Sarusi. Okay, the 6 hostages who were held in terrible conditions by Hamas in Rafah. And when the IDF entered Rafah and was getting closer to the place where they were being held, they were executed by their captors. And then there was this huge public outcry demanding to make a hostage deal. You know, this was the most terrible example of how increasing the military pressure can actually worsen the conditions of the hostages and eventually lead to their death. And in order to try to stop the momentum behind the demonstrations of the hostage families, these 2 leaks were made to newspapers abroad with an attempt then to influence the conversation inside Israel. One leak is this Jewish Chronicle story, which turned out to be not just a leak, but a manipulation of intelligence materials and presenting it in a very, very twisted and false way, making the argument that Hamas is trying to sneak hostages out of Gaza through the Philadelphia corridor in order to justify Netanyahu's insistence to hold on to Philadelphia and not make any kind of deal, because Hamas said we want to see a withdrawal from there.
Right.
And this was published in the Jewish Chronicle at the time. And this is something that Feldstein and Ulrich have been questioned about. And then there's the Bild story. Okay, the Bild is the largest newspaper in Germany. It's a very pro-Israeli newspaper. It has strong ties to Netanyahu's office, and specifically, Surulik Einhorn is considered to be the one who's maintaining that relationship. And there was a leak of documents allegedly coming from Sinwar that prove, supposedly, that the protests, the demonstrations of the hostage families are beneficial to Hamas. Which, you know, to me, I think it's just an outrage to say anything like this. What we keep hearing, Vivian, since the deal that was signed in January of 2025 from all the hostages who come back alive, is how much these demonstrations in Israel, led by their own families, gave them hope and gave them the power to survive. We hear again and again, you know, from the female soldiers of Nahal Oz base, and from the hostages of kibbutz Nir Oz, and everybody, those who came back from the Nova, and they keep saying, we saw the protests in Israel on Al Jazeera, or we heard about them on the Israeli radio, or the terrorists showed us, you know, pictures from the demonstrations, and it gave us air. It gave us the power to survive.
But it's important to mention here that because we were living this at the same time, in real time and on the ground, that at this time, the Netanyahu government was saying to the public, stay home, stop.
Don't demonstrate. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then we hear directly, wait, this is saving these guys. This is
so this document that was given to Bild was supposed to prove the point that the demonstrations are bad and they help Hamas.
Right.
And again, this was based on taking some very, very real intelligence documents that were leaked to Eli Feldstein, who did not have security clearance, and then manipulating them in the way that it was eventually, kind of leaked to the German newspaper. And so this is an investigation that touches, first of all, on dealing with highly classified documents,
Right.
but also with an attempt to derail the hostage negotiations and really harm national security interests of Israel.
And we'll get to why it would be in the interest, or the government would perceive it to be in their interest, to derail the hostage negotiations or to not pursue them. Choose how you want to phrase it.
Yeah. But I think the important thing to see here is that the issue of the hostages really connects these two scandals, because I want to mention one more thing that's being investigated, Vivian. As part of Qatargate, the police is looking into, again, and this is still a suspicion, not proven, but into messaging that these Netanyahu aides put out against Egypt.
Right.
Trashing Egypt, saying that Egypt is preparing for war with Israel, and trying to portray Egypt as a non-reliable mediator in the attempts to reach a hostage deal and a ceasefire. Now, obviously, this serves the interests of Qatar, that wants to be the mediator. And I have to say, I respect what Qatar has done specifically as a mediator in this war. I'm not speaking out against it. I think if they contributed to the release of even one hostage, great, okay? I mean, that does not erase everything they did before, but I think the fact that we are using them as a mediator is good. I'm not against it. But Israel always insisted in all the previous rounds of fighting in Gaza to have an Egyptian channel alongside the Qatari one, and often to prefer the Egyptian channel over the Qatari one. This was one of the biggest fights at the time between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama in the 2014 Gaza war, where Obama and John Kerry preferred Qatari mediation to end the war, and Netanyahu said, no, I prefer President Sisi of Egypt, who is an ally of Israel, to be the mediator. So fast forward a decade, and suddenly people in Netanyahu's office are allegedly running a media campaign against Egypt in the midst of the war while getting paid by Qatar. How does this serve the interest of the hostages? You tell me. Because, and Netanyahu's response now, and this is really crazy stuff, what is he saying? He's saying, well, what do you want from my media team? Look at the negotiating team that worked on the hostage issue. They flew to Qatar. They met with the Qataris. Well, yeah, but they did it with a mandate to try to bring the hostages home.
Right.
Your people, according to the police investigation, put out a nasty campaign, fabricated campaign against Egypt at a time when Egypt was also trying to help with the hostages, and maybe could have been more helpful, by the way.
So we have this Qatargate. I happen to think that both investigations ultimately will probably converge.
I agree.
We have these investigations going on, and they are, of course, initiated and pursued by the Shin Bet.
Yes.
The
because
equivalent.
these are security investigations. This is completely within the mandate of the Shin Bet to invest. If the Shin Bet did not investigate the possibility that people working in the closest orbit of the prime minister were receiving payments from a foreign country, putting aside the fact that it's Qatar and all the complications, even if it was Canada, Vivian, okay? I would, even if it was the United States, to be honest, I do not want any foreign government to be paying regularly the people working around the prime minister of Israel. And it is completely in the mandate of the Shin Bet to investigate this kind of situation.
Exactly. And I just wanted to make that point to make it clear. And who heads the Shin Bet? Ronen Bar. Ronen Bar was appointed by the Bennett government, and he has continued in the role. He has publicly stated, hey, I take responsibility for October 7th. I do think there should be a state commission of inquiry. We'll just have to wait and see what either of those statements actually means, particularly taking responsibility, but at least he's uttered the words. And it is right around the time that Qatar Gate kind of bubbles up, that Prime Minister Netanyahu says, you know what, Ronen Bar, you're fired. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So
So
what's the timing and why? And I'm thinking, wait, if you've had such a big problem with them for the last 18 months.
exactly. Yeah. Okay, Vivian, let's imagine that on October 8th or on October 9, because on October 8th, he was completely shell-shocked. But on October 9, Netanyahu would come out to the public and say, this is the biggest failure in the country's history. Everybody involved has to go. I'm sending home the chief of staff and the head of the Shin Bet. I'll give them 1 month so we have a transition. And I myself will resign within a year after we, with a new military and intelligence leadership, will decimate Hamas. Okay. But what did Netanyahu do? Netanyahu came out, basically said, nobody's going anywhere. Everybody's staying. We're in the midst of a war. And he kept Ronen Bar after the failure of October 7, to which I agree, Ronen Bar carries a very high responsibility. He kept him for more than a year, never expressed any will to get rid of him, any mistrust of him. In fact, on November 5, 2024, 13 months after October 7, Netanyahu fired Yoav Gallant. You remember this, right? Defense minister?
Yeah.
And then everybody said, well, obviously now he's going to fire the chief of staff of the army and the head of the Shin Bet. And Netanyahu put out a statement saying this is untrue. I have trust in the heads of the security agencies, including Ronen Bar. I just spoke to them, and they are staying as long as we are fighting this war. And then comes the investigation, and suddenly he does not have any trust in Ronen Bar, and it becomes the most urgent thing in the world to fire him. Why is it urgent to fire him now in March and in April, and it was okay to keep him a year ago? What changed? We're still fighting a war in Gaza. We still have hostages. What changed? Okay. Why did Netanyahu say in November, just half a year ago, that he has trust in this guy and wants him to stay? And suddenly, it's the most urgent thing in the world to get rid of him, and you drag the entire country into a huge tension, and demonstrations are back in the street and everything, and, very contentious hearing in the Supreme Court. Why? What has changed? Except for the fact that your own aides are being investigated by his agency. And maybe you want to appoint a loyalist who will shut down the investigation.
And I want you to comment briefly on the whole Supreme Court issue, because what happened, of course, is that Netanyahu fires Ronen Bar, says, I've got a short list of candidates. What happens is that the Attorney General, Gali Barav Miara, says to the government, she says, I'm not saying you can't fire him, but I'm saying that
there's a process of firing them.
There's a process. And that's, so when Simcha Rothman and I discussed this, he said, it's clear, it's in the law, there's a Shin Bet Act legislation, and it says, can be appointed by and fired by. And I'm like, well, that's kind of black letter, because there are always kind of, processes, procedures, as lawyers often like to say, at a certain point, form becomes substance. How you do things is very important. And throwing out the head of the Shin Bet, on his behind overnight, particularly in such a tense...
When there's an ongoing investigation,
There's an ongoing investigation, there's a war, and you still got 59 hostages languishing in Hamas hell. Is this really where the country needs to be focusing its energies?
But that's so, Viv, that's one argument, obviously. Is this where the country needs to be? No, it isn't. But I'm putting that aside. I think from the legal standpoint, the Supreme... So there were, obviously appeals to the Supreme Court to stop the firing of the Shin Bet Chief. And I think the judges, and this was a panel that had two of the more liberal judges, but also Justice Noam Tibon, who's like this kind of conservative, a marker of the Supreme Court. They reached a unanimous decision, 3-0, that basically said, yes, the government has the authority to fire Ronen Bar, period. No discussion about that. The government can fire him, but there is a legal way to fire him and there is an illegal way to fire him. And
Right.
if you want to fire the head of the Shin Bet, which is one of the most sensitive positions in the Israeli government system, and remember, the Shin Bet has tools that, if used in an improper way, turn Israel from a democratic state to a police state, period. And that's why the appointment of the Shin Bet always, appointment of the chief of the Shin Bet always goes through the special commission for high-level appointments in Israel. And in the history of the country, we've never had a situation like this where the prime minister wants to get rid of the head of the Shin Bet while there is a Shin Bet investigation against his team, which raises questions of a conflict of interest. So the Supreme Court said, listen, at the end of the road, we're probably going to let you fire him. I think this is evident when you read the decision of three judges. But you're not going to be able to do it overnight when there's a question of conflict of interest, when there's a question of the legal process of firing. For example, should the same commission
Right.
that approves his appointment also be convened to discuss his removal? That's and I think the court said very clearly, yes, if you want to get rid of him, the firing has to be based on factual findings, and it has to go through the same commission that you would use to appoint him or the next head of the Shin Bet. And this is where it's at. Do I think Ronen Bar will be the head of the Shin Bet 2 or 3 months from today? Probably not. But for now, he is the head of the Shin Bet under the decree that the court had put out. And I think Netanyahu, instead of saying, okay, I rushed it too much, I was panicking, I played my cards wrong,
Right.
he's doubling and tripling down with attacks on the court. Some of the ministers around him are calling him not to respect the decision of the court, which is just a call for anarchy. You know what, Vivian? I don't want to respect the tax law in the country anymore, okay? I pay a lot of taxes to the government. I don't think I get proper services. I don't want to respect it anymore. I mean, come on, is this the kind of society we want to be? There's rules and laws, and they have to be followed. And Netanyahu could have said, okay, we rushed it, let's do it properly. But instead, I think his own reaction is raising very serious questions about his motivations and what he wants to achieve in this. And I want to make one last point, which is very important to understand. Ronen Bar himself has signaled that if Netanyahu chose to appoint one of his 2 deputies, because Ronen has 2 deputies, to lead the Shin Bet instead of him, he would just resign by himself, put the keys, say, I failed on October 7, I'm going home.
Right.
The fear that I think Ronen feels and that many, many Israelis share is that Netanyahu will want to appoint someone who is a loyalist to him personally to lead the Shin Bet. And in Israel, with the very weak checks and balances that exist in our system, if the Shin Bet becomes a politically motivated agency, this is terrible, and this is dangerous, and it should be concerning to any Israeli citizen regarding of political opinion and background. Because the Shin Bet has very powerful tools that can be used in all the wrong ways. And we heard in the last few days, the former head of the Shin Bet, Yoram Cohen, who was appointed by Netanyahu in 2011, who is a religious right-wing man, come out and tell very disturbing stories about how Netanyahu had asked him at the time, a decade ago, to use the powers of the Shin Bet in improper ways. One time to spy on the other defense chiefs in the country,
Right.
and another time to put out a decision that Naftali Bennett cannot be a member of the country's security cabinet. This was at a time when Bennett was a minister in the Netanyahu government and was pushing for a hard line against Hamas in Gaza when Netanyahu actually wanted to maintain quiet with Hamas. And so Netanyahu, according to Yoram Cohen's testimony, calls him in, says, I need you to get rid of Bennett, put out some kind of a Shin Bet statement or kind of, decree that he does not have security clearance. This is crazy. This is police state. And I think this is at the heart of the crisis. If Netanyahu basically said, I'm going to choose the next leader of this agency from its 2 deputies, because while I don't have trust in Ronen Bar personally, I have trust in the Shin Bet as an institution.
Right.
And as an agency, there will be no crisis. Ronen would put down the keys and go home. Ronen Bar, in my analysis, and I've never spoken to him, just to be clear, I've never spoken to this man, and I see him as one of the most, biggest failures of the country because of October 7th. But I think in his analysis, he's afraid that the agency that he knows so well and he knows what it's capable of doing will be put in the hands of a politically motivated loyalist. And that's a danger to every Israeli. And this is what's at the heart of this crisis, really.
And I think that it's also important to point out that the trust that Israelis have in all of their institutions at the moment is very, very fraught. I want to just close with this. The Supreme Court, in my view, handled this dilemma so elegantly because what they said was, okay, government and Shin Bet or Attorney General, you have until April 20th, which is basically tomorrow. It's next week. You have until April 20th to sit down, work out a proper procedure, do this in a manner that is consistent with the procedural kind of fairness, appropriate accountability standards in a democracy, including, for example, telling Ronen Bar the actual reason for his termination, not just saying, bye, we can fire you, off you go. But I want to also make one point because as you were speaking, it struck me and it's very profound. Simcha Rothman, when I spoke to him, spoke of the subversion of democracy. He said that we have the power to fire, and for anyone to come along to the elected officials, the government, and say, yeah, okay, you have the power legally, but we're saying you can't do it. To him, he presents that as being such a stark, clear subversion of democracy. And what you've presented, of course, is a very different view. The subversion of democracy is undermining the procedural safeguards, which are accountability, which maintain public confidence in the integrity of the institutions that have so much power.
And again, I'm not saying that the government should not be able to eventually complete this. I get it. But there are rules for reasons, and they do have to be followed. And specifically, with member of Knesset Rothman, I have to say, unlike Ronen Bar, who, again, I'm not a fan of in any way, and I'm not protecting him. This is not the issue, but at least came forward and said, I fucked up completely. There's no other way. We have not yet heard Simcha Rothman address his contribution to October 7th. And the fact that he spent almost the entire year 2023 until that dark day dividing Israelis, causing internal stir, treating half of the people of the country almost like an enemy, doing everything to hurt the other side, insult the other side, get the temperature up internally. And we know today that this was one of the reasons that our enemies felt Israel was weak and that Israel could be vulnerable. And I'm not saying, this is Simcha Rothman's fault. No, this is not the argument I'm making. Just like I'm not saying this is all Ronen Bar's fault or this is all Bibi Netanyahu's fault or whatever. But at least have the decency to, come and say, where was I wrong? But he's the kind of person who's never wrong. Okay, even when he is insulting families of hostages and bereaved families at his Knesset committee, when they come and try to say a few words, he's never wrong, apparently. And someone who's never wrong, I always have a bit of a suspicion when coming to debate them about these issues, because I'm wrong sometimes, I can tell you that.
Well, I'm not. Just ask my children.
Well, you're special, Viv. You're a special case.
Amir, I wish we had more time because I did want to get into the way in which Simcha Rothman has been conducting committee hearings with the hostage families, because I did have the opportunity to speak with him about that the other day, as well as yet again raising the temperature by introducing further legislation on the judicial reform issue that was passed.
For another time. You
have to go on with your day, and I think I can cover it. But thank you so much. That was fascinating, as always.
Yeah, thank you, Viv. And let's just end this by saying, Chag Sameach, and hope that the next time we speak, we will have a hostage deal in place, and we'll have our brothers and sisters, including my friend Omri Miran, come back from the tunnels of Gaza.
Well, you and I know many others, are working hard to make that a reality and won't let this noise, if I can call it that, get in the way of our efforts. Thank you, Amir. Chag Sameach.
Okay.
Be well.
Chag Sameach. Bye-bye.
And thank you, as always, for being here. I'm spending the week of Passover in Toronto and then heading back to Israel. Just catching my breath, seeing friends, family, and quite serendipitously, I'm here for the big Canadian federal election that was just called a few weeks ago. If you have not seen it yet, check out my first piece that was published in the UK Jewish Chronicle on Wednesday, where I get into the strong anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel that has become very normalized in Canada since October 7th, and especially in and among the members of the governing Liberal Party. There was a special post at the stateoftelaviv.com website posted on Thursday about this wild political time in Canada, where I get into the already very testy relationship between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. You'll want to check it out. Prime Minister Netanyahu posted a very sharp rebuke of Prime Minister Carney and his comments on Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip. That went down last week, and it is very spicy, or harif, as we say in Hebrew. This Canadian election is of such critical importance, probably the most important in my lifetime, and it's certainly important for the Canadian Jewish community. Very much so. So more to come on that, but in the meantime, we will see very soon what goes down in the Israeli Supreme Court on April 20th. That's the deadline that they issued to have the government and the opposing parties come back with a solution to how they're going to proceed with firing Ronen Bar. I hope you're having a memorable holiday, Passover, Easter, and anything else. Thanks again for being here. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Yon Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back.